If this message appears before you during another evening of circular thinking and anxious mind loops, it's because your consciousness has reached a point where conventional anxiety management can no longer provide the relief you need. The repetitive thoughts, the escalating worry patterns, the feeling of being trapped in mental cycles that seem to generate more anxiety than they resolve. All of this is your nervous system calling for the quantum healing approach that interrupts anxiety loops through consciousness recognition rather than mental control. This quantum healing method operates through what neuroscientists call pattern interruption. But what they don't understand is that true interruption doesn't happen through cognitive techniques or mindfulness exercises. It emerges when consciousness recognizes anxiety loops as temporary weather patterns in the vast sky of aware presence that remains calm regardless of what mental activity is moving through it. The synchronicity that brought you to this understanding means your awareness has evolved beyond trying to stop anxious thoughts and toward recognizing the peaceful observer that watches all mental activity without being disturbed by any of it. Your nervous system has been preparing for this recognition through every sleepless night of racing thoughts, developing the sensitivity needed to access the eye of the storm that exists within every anxiety loop. Something in the healing intelligence of the universe recognized that you're ready for the approach that doesn't just provide temporary relief from anxiety loops, but reveals the space within consciousness where repetitive thinking cannot actually create suffering. This isn't another anxiety management technique. This is recognition of how consciousness can observe anxiety without resistance while maintaining unshakable inner stability. Right now, even if anxious thoughts are present, can you sense the awareness that observes whatever mental activity might be occurring? There's a part of you that remains completely peaceful even when thoughts are racing in circles. This observer consciousness is the key to quantum healing that transforms anxiety loops from suffering into temporary phenomena that pass through awareness naturally. You've been receiving glimpses of this healing during moments when anxiety loops suddenly dissolve without effort, haven't you? Brief experiences of profound relief that emerge when you stop fighting the thoughts, demonstrating that peace isn't something you create through controlling mental activity, but something you access through recognizing what remains unchanged by any thought pattern. The reason this quantum healing approach is emerging now isn't accidental. Every night of circular thinking has been calibrating your consciousness to appreciate the profound relief that becomes available when the observer of anxiety loops stabilizes as your primary identity, rather than identifying with the anxious thoughts themselves. The anxiety loops feel like they have complete control over your evening hours, don't they? Your mind latches onto a worry and then spirals through every possible variation, outcome, and consequence until you're exhausted but more anxious than when the cycle began. Sleep becomes impossible because your brain seems incapable of stopping the repetitive analysis that generates more questions than answers. You've probably noticed that anxiety loops follow predictable patterns, starting with a genuine concern, but quickly escalating into catastrophic thinking that feels logical in the moment, but seems obviously excessive when you're not caught in the cycle. The thoughts feel urgent and important, demanding immediate attention and solution, yet working through them mentally never provides lasting relief. The worst part might be how aware you are that the thinking is unproductive while feeling powerless to stop it. You recognize that reviewing the same scenarios repeatedly isn't helping, yet your mind continues the loops as if compelled by some internal mechanism that operates beyond conscious control. This creates additional anxiety about having anxiety, adding meta-worry to the original concerns. Nighttime seems to amplify anxiety loops because there are fewer distractions available to interrupt the mental activity. What felt manageable during busy daytime hours becomes overwhelming when you're trying to rest, as if your mind uses the quiet space to process every concern it couldn't address during active periods. You might have tried various techniques to interrupt anxiety loops: meditation apps, breathing exercises, journaling, progressive muscle relaxation, with mixed results. Some approaches provide temporary relief, but the underlying pattern of circular thinking seems to reassert itself, especially during periods of stress or when facing uncertain situations. The physical symptoms that accompany anxiety loops often create additional mental content to worry about. Racing heart rate, muscle tension, digestive discomfort, or sleep disruption become new topics for anxious analysis, creating loops about the loops and making the whole experience more complex and distressing. Perhaps most frustrating is how anxiety loops seem to activate during transition times when you most need mental clarity and emotional stability. Before important events, during major decisions, or when facing changes that require adaptive responses, your mind becomes consumed with worst-case scenarios instead of accessing the wisdom and creativity that would actually be helpful. You've probably noticed that anxiety loops often focus on situations beyond your immediate control, creating mental rehearsals for problems that may never materialize while using enormous mental energy that could be directed toward actual solutions for real challenges. The isolation that anxiety loops create can be profound, as the internal experience is difficult to communicate to others who haven't experienced similar patterns. Well-meaning advice to just stop worrying or think positive thoughts misses the involuntary nature of the mental activity and can create additional shame about your inability to control something that feels automatic. Every night of anxiety loops, every period of circular thinking, every moment when your mind seemed trapped in repetitive patterns that generated more worry than clarity has been preparing your consciousness for this recognition that anxiety loops aren't evidence of mental dysfunction. Their awareness temporarily forgetting its naturally spacious essence while developing the sensitivity needed to access unshakable inner stability. The frustration you felt with techniques that provide temporary relief but don't prevent the next anxiety loop tells a perfect story of preparation for lasting transformation. Breathing exercises that helped briefly were teaching you to distinguish between imposed calm and natural peace. Cognitive strategies that worked initially were demonstrating that controlling thoughts can't create the spaciousness that remains unchanged by mental content. Think of how a lighthouse remains stable and illuminating regardless of the storm patterns that move around it. Your journey through anxious thinking has been developing the understanding that authentic stability comes from recognizing the awareness that remains peaceful regardless of mental weather, rather than trying to control which thoughts arise. Every attempt to stop anxiety loops through mental effort was preparing you to understand that lasting peace emerges when consciousness stops fighting against anxious thoughts and starts recognizing the spacious presence that contains all mental activity without being disturbed by any of it. The exhaustion from trying to control repetitive thinking was consciousness calling your attention to the effortless peace available through recognition rather than management. The timing of your most intense anxiety loops corresponds perfectly with periods when your sensitivity was developing enough to eventually appreciate the profound relief available through quantum healing. What seemed like escalating mental chaos was actually consciousness building the contrast needed to recognize authentic spaciousness when it stabilizes as your natural state. Your nervous system has been like an instrument gradually learning to distinguish between the noise of anxious thinking and the silence that contains all mental activity. The repetitive thoughts, the escalating worry, the feeling of being trapped in mental cycles, all of it was preparation for recognizing the vast space of awareness that remains calm, regardless of thought content. The resistance you felt toward accepting anxiety loops as a permanent aspect of your mental landscape has been your deeper wisdom recognizing that circular thinking isn't your true nature, but temporary identification with mental activity that can be transcended through understanding rather than control. Even your concerns about whether peaceful sleep is possible, given your tendency toward evening anxiety, have been consciousness ensuring that when quantum healing does occur, it will be based on genuine recognition rather than temporary technique that loses effectiveness when challenges arise. Something profound is beginning to settle in your mental landscape right now. Can you sense it? That subtle but unmistakable feeling of space opening around thoughts that previously felt urgent and consuming, of your entire internal environment beginning to shift from reactive anxiety toward responsive calm, of mental activity starting to feel less dense and more transparent. Your brain's default mode network is literally reorganizing as this recognition deepens. Neural pathways that have been hyperactive in maintaining repetitive thought patterns are beginning to settle into coherent rhythms that support spacious awareness rather than circular thinking. The areas of your brain responsible for rumination are recalibrating to operate from observation rather than identification. The electromagnetic field around your nervous system is shifting into patterns that support sustained mental calm rather than chronic activation. When your bioelectric field achieves coherence, it creates optimal conditions for the kind of mental spaciousness that allows anxiety loops to be present without resistance, while maintaining the peaceful observer that remains unaffected by thought content. Your autonomic nervous system is beginning to remember its capacity for operating from rest and restoration mode as the primary state, rather than the brief interludes between anxious activation that have characterized your evening hours. This parasympathetic dominance creates the internal environment where mental clarity emerges naturally rather than being forced through thought control. Notice how your relationship to whatever anxious thoughts might be present is naturally becoming more spacious and less urgent. This is your consciousness beginning to recognize itself as the awareness that observes mental activity rather than the mental activity itself, creating the foundation for quantum healing that transforms anxiety loops from suffering into temporary phenomena. But here's what's building in your consciousness that will completely transform your relationship to evening anxiety. The recognition that anxiety loops aren't evidence of mental malfunction. They're consciousness temporarily forgetting its naturally spacious essence and now preparing to remember through the magnificent process of quantum healing recognition. The reason this healing approach is becoming available now is because your awareness has developed enough sensitivity through anxious experiences to appreciate the profound relief that emerges when the observer of anxiety loop stabilizes as your primary identity rather than something you occasionally access between periods of mental turbulence. Quantum healing doesn't just affect your individual anxiety patterns. It creates coherence that influences the mental state and emotional well-being of everyone in your environment. When you demonstrate how to observe anxiety without resistance, people around you naturally begin accessing their own capacity for mental spaciousness. Feel this settling presence building in your awareness as we explore the most profound secret of interrupting anxiety loops tonight. The understanding that will reveal how consciousness can witness repetitive thinking without being disturbed, while maintaining the peaceful stability that makes restful sleep naturally available. 2 years ago, my evenings were dominated by anxiety loops that made restful sleep nearly impossible. My mind would latch onto concerns and cycle through endless variations of worry, creating elaborate mental scenarios that felt important to resolve, but only generated more questions and anxiety. I tried every technique available for managing evening anxiety, yet the fundamental pattern of circular thinking continued to disrupt my sleep and peace of mind. The cruel irony was that my efforts to stop anxiety loops were creating more anxiety loops. Every technique became another thing to monitor and execute perfectly. Every failed attempt to quiet my mind generated additional worry about my inability to manage my own mental activity. I was caught in meta-anxiety, worried about being worried, anxious about my anxiety patterns. During the worst periods, anxiety loops would continue for hours, keeping me awake well past midnight while my mind processed every concern it hadn't addressed during the day. The thoughts felt urgent and logical in the moment, but reviewing them the next morning revealed how unproductive and repetitive the mental activity had been. The breakthrough came during what felt like my most intense evening of circular thinking, when something in me simply gave up the effort to stop or control the anxious thoughts. Instead of trying to make the loops go away or analyzing why they were happening, I became curious about the awareness that was observing the mental activity without being swept away by it. I realized that beneath all the anxious thinking, there was a part of me that had never been anxious. A spacious presence that observed racing thoughts with the same equanimity it observed peaceful thoughts. This observer consciousness wasn't affected by the content of mental activity any more than a movie screen is affected by the films projected upon it. The quantum healing that followed was immediate and profound. Not because the anxious thoughts disappeared completely, but because my relationship to them transformed so dramatically that they lost their power to create suffering or disrupt my sleep. I discovered that I could remain peacefully present while mental loops continued their activity, like watching clouds pass through an unchanging sky. Within weeks of learning to rest in observer consciousness rather than identifying with anxious thoughts, my entire relationship to evening anxiety transformed. Loops that previously kept me awake for hours would be observed with curious detachment and naturally dissolve when they stopped receiving the energy of identification and resistance. But the most remarkable change was discovering that my presence had become calming to others. Family members slept better when I was peaceful, co-workers seemed less reactive during stressful situations, and even pets appeared more relaxed in my presence. The quantum healing had created a field of coherent calm that influenced everyone in my environment. The recognition that changed everything was understanding that I wasn't someone who had anxiety problems that needed to be solved. I was spacious awareness, temporarily believing that anxious thoughts defined my experience. The healing happened when consciousness remembered its essential, peaceful nature and stopped taking thought content so personally. Now I use every anxiety loop as an opportunity to return to spacious presence. Repetitive thoughts still arise occasionally, but they pass through awareness like weather through sky, creating temporary experiences rather than defining my fundamental relationship to evening rest and mental peace. If you're exhausted from fighting anxiety loops and ready to discover the spacious presence that exists beneath all mental activity, if you've sensed that true peace comes from recognition rather than control, if you've had glimpses of the observer consciousness that remains unaffected by thought content, then you're ready for the quantum healing that makes restful evenings your natural experience. Subscribe and keep walking this path of healing with us. Not just to this channel, but to this recognition that you are not someone who has anxiety loops. You are spacious awareness, temporarily believing in the reality of repetitive thinking. Here's what psychology, neuroscience, and even mindfulness approaches don't want you to understand about quantum healing for anxiety loops. Every technique that promises to help you stop or manage repetitive thinking actually reinforces the fundamental misunderstanding that you are someone who has anxious thoughts rather than spacious awareness, temporarily identifying with mental activity. This identification itself maintains the neural patterns that generate and sustain anxiety loops. The revolutionary recognition that makes quantum healing effortless is this: anxiety loops aren't something that happens to consciousness. Anxiety loops are what consciousness experiences when it believes it is the repetitive thoughts rather than the spacious awareness in which all mental activity appears and disappears. Your nervous system creates anxiety loops based on this fundamental case of mistaken identity. When you recognize yourself as the spacious observer of all mental activity rather than the anxious thoughts themselves, your entire system receives different instructions about how to respond to repetitive thinking. Instead of fighting against thoughts or trying to change mental content, your nervous system begins operating from the coherent calm that emerges when consciousness knows its essential spacious nature. This obliterates every approach to anxiety that maintains separation between the observer and the observed, between consciousness and mental content, between spacious awareness and anxious thoughts. Your racing thoughts aren't happening to a separate you. Your racing thoughts are consciousness temporarily exploring what it feels like to believe in mental limitation while never actually becoming constrained by any thought pattern. The difference between anxiety management and quantum healing is this. Anxiety management tries to control or eliminate anxious thoughts while maintaining the belief that you are someone who has problems with repetitive thinking. Quantum healing recognizes that there is no separate you who has anxiety loops. There is only spacious consciousness temporarily believing in the reality of mental projections that appear and disappear in awareness. When you understand this, you realize that anxiety loops aren't evidence of mental dysfunction. They're consciousness exploring what it feels like to believe in mental limitation while maintaining its unlimited capacity for peaceful presence. The healing happens when awareness stops taking repetitive thoughts personally and starts recognizing them as temporary weather patterns in the vast sky of spacious consciousness. The access to permanent evening peace comes not through managing anxiety loops better, but through recognizing that the one who would manage anxiety is itself a mental construct. And what you actually are is the spacious awareness in which all mental activity appears and disappears without disturbing your essential peace. The quantum healing for anxiety loops is already occurring in your consciousness right now, and the changes emerging in your mental landscape confirm that spacious presence has begun organizing itself as your primary evening experience, rather than something you occasionally access between periods of repetitive thinking. Your relationship to anxious thoughts is naturally becoming more spacious as mental activity begins to have more room around it. Racing thoughts still arise, but they don't immediately capture your complete attention the way they used to. There's often an awareness present that can observe repetitive thinking without getting caught in the content or urgency of the mental loops. Evening hours are starting to feel more peaceful, not because you have fewer concerns, but because you're relating to worries from a more spacious internal state. Issues that previously triggered hours of circular thinking often seem naturally prioritized when consciousness operates from clarity rather than reactive urgency. Mental processing becomes more efficient and less exhausting. Your body's response to evening mental activity is beginning to shift from immediate tension toward relaxation that supports rather than interferes with rest. Physical symptoms that used to accompany anxiety loops, muscle tightness, racing heart, digestive discomfort, often dissolve naturally as spacious awareness becomes your baseline evening state. Sleep onset is improving as your mind learns to settle into rest, rather than continuing repetitive analysis during transition periods. When anxious thoughts do arise during bedtime, there's often a natural spaciousness that allows them to be present without creating the resistance that previously generated more mental activity. Dreams have become more peaceful and restorative, rather than continuing the anxious themes that used to characterize sleep periods. When you do wake during the night, there's often a calm presence available rather than immediate reactivation of worry patterns that used to make returning to sleep difficult. People around you may notice changes in your evening presence and energy, even when they can't identify exactly what's different. Family interactions might become more relaxed, household atmosphere could feel calmer, or others might mention that you seem more peaceful during evening hours, when anxiety loops used to be most active. Your approach to evening routines and bedtime preparation is naturally becoming more intuitive and less effortful as consciousness learns to support rest through spacious presence rather than trying to control mental activity through technique or distraction. But here's what makes this moment in your healing journey critically urgent. The collective human consciousness is evolving beyond anxiety-based mental functioning toward spacious presence. But this transformation requires individuals who understand quantum healing to demonstrate what becomes possible when awareness stops identifying with repetitive thinking. the restlessness you've been feeling about conventional anxiety management approaches, that knowing that true peace must be available without constant mental effort, that sense that your natural evening state should be calm rather than anxious. All of this is consciousness calling itself awake to its inherently peaceful nature. Your nervous system has been calibrated through every anxiety loop, every sleepless night, every period of circular thinking to develop the sensitivity needed to recognize and appreciate the profound relief that emerges when spaciousness becomes your natural evening experience. The cosmic timing that brought you to this understanding about quantum healing isn't coincidental. The same evolutionary forces that are creating opportunities for collective consciousness transformation are also making individual anxiety healing more accessible to those whose awareness is ready to transcend mental identification through recognition of spacious presence. What you heal within your consciousness regarding anxiety loops, the world gains spaciousness through you. Your individual transformation from repetitive thinking patterns to spacious presence contributes to a collective shift in how humanity relates to mental activity and evening peace. Every anxiety loop pattern that dissolves in your awareness becomes unavailable in the shared human experience of mental suffering. But here's the crucial distinction that determines whether your evening peace becomes permanent or remains temporary. The difference between trying to eliminate anxiety loops and recognizing yourself as the spacious awareness in which repetitive thoughts appear and disappear. Most approaches focus on changing mental content, but quantum healing recognizes that what you actually are is never touched by any thought content, peaceful or anxious. Alignment with authentic spaciousness isn't about maintaining calm thoughts or eliminating repetitive mental activity through effort. Alignment is recognizing that there is no separate you who has anxiety problems. There is only spacious consciousness temporarily believing in the reality of mental projections while never actually becoming disturbed by any thought content. When you operate from this understanding, you stop trying to fix anxiety loops and start appreciating repetitive thoughts as temporary weather patterns in the vast sky of spacious awareness. The evening peace that emerges isn't something you create through technique. It's what naturally remains when consciousness stops identifying with mental activity. The recognition this understanding requires isn't about forcing yourself to believe you're peaceful or trying to maintain spacious states through willpower. It's about relaxing the effort to control mental content and allowing the recognition that consciousness and spaciousness are inseparable. There is only awareness exploring what it feels like to believe in mental chaos while never actually becoming disturbed by any thought patterns. Your evening experience becomes a perfect mirror that shows you when consciousness is identifying with mental content versus recognizing itself as the spacious observer of all mental activity. Every anxiety loop becomes an opportunity to return to the peaceful presence that you actually are. Comment this word: tonight. Feel what happens when you make this declaration not as someone trying to get rid of anxiety loops, but as consciousness recognizing its own naturally spacious essence that remains peaceful, regardless of what mental activity might be present this evening. When you stabilize in the recognition that you are spacious awareness, observing all mental activity, capabilities that seemed impossible from the perspective of anxiety-based evening functioning become as natural as breathing. But these aren't supernatural calm powers. These are the normal functions of consciousness when it stops identifying with thought content and recognizes its essential spacious nature. Evening hours transform into periods of natural restoration rather than mental processing time. Instead of your mind using quiet moments to cycle through concerns, consciousness naturally settles into the spacious presence that supports genuine rest and regeneration. Sleep becomes effortless because there's no internal resistance to rest. Your mental clarity during evening hours becomes extraordinary because consciousness is no longer consumed by repetitive thinking patterns. Decision-making about next-day priorities happens efficiently rather than generating anxiety loops about all possible outcomes. Creative solutions often emerge naturally during peaceful evening states. Physical relaxation occurs automatically as your nervous system operates from coherent spaciousness rather than chronic mental activation. Muscle tension dissolves, breathing naturally deepens, and your body prepares for restorative sleep without requiring specific relaxation techniques or effort to calm physical systems. Relationships benefit enormously as family members and household dynamics naturally become more peaceful around your spacious evening presence. Conversations become more meaningful, conflicts resolve more easily, and others often comment on feeling more relaxed during evening hours when you're demonstrating spacious awareness. Your relationship to next-day challenges transforms completely as evening mental processing becomes spacious and wise rather than anxious and repetitive. Instead of generating worry about upcoming events, consciousness naturally accesses appropriate preparation without the mental loops that create anxiety rather than actual readiness. Dream quality improves dramatically as your mind enters sleep from spacious awareness rather than mental agitation. Dreams often become more peaceful, insightful, and restorative rather than continuing anxious themes that used to characterize sleep periods. Perhaps most remarkably, your evening presence becomes naturally calming to others who struggle with their own anxiety patterns. Children settle more easily, partners feel more relaxed, and even pets respond to the coherent calm that emerges when consciousness operates from spacious recognition rather than mental identification. But the most profound benefit is complete freedom from anxiety about having anxiety loops. When you recognize that you are the spacious observer of all mental activity, there's nothing to fear about repetitive thoughts, because they can't actually disturb your essential nature any more than clouds can disturb the sky they pass through. Here's the ultimate secret that revolutionizes everything about anxiety loops and evening peace. You have never actually had anxiety loops. What you've experienced as repetitive thinking, mental cycling, and evening mental agitation has been spacious consciousness exploring what it would feel like to believe in mental limitation while never actually becoming constrained by any thought pattern. Every anxiety loop has been perfect spaciousness, investigating what repetitive thinking feels like. Every evening of mental cycling has been infinite awareness, exploring what it means to believe in mental limitation. Every moment of feeling trapped by circular thoughts has been consciousness playing a temporary game of forgetting its spacious nature, so it could have the joy of remembering itself through quantum healing recognition. This recognition completely obliterates every framework that maintains separation between anxious mental states and spacious mental states, between problematic thinking and peaceful thinking, between mental agitation and calm awareness. There is nothing to fix because consciousness is already perfect in every expression, including every temporary exploration of apparent mental limitation. When this understanding stabilizes, you realize that every mental experience is perfect expression of spacious consciousness, regardless of whether thoughts are repetitive or peaceful, anxious or calm. You stop trying to change mental content and start appreciating every thought as consciousness celebrating its unlimited creativity through the magnificent game of temporary self-forgetting and recognition. The profound insight that transforms everything is understanding that the one who would have anxiety loops is itself a mental construct, and what you actually are is the spacious awareness in which all mental activity appears and disappears like waves in an ocean that remains fundamentally calm regardless of surface movement. Your individual evening experience becomes a celebration of infinite spacious consciousness, temporarily exploring what it would feel like to believe in mental chaos while maintaining its unlimited capacity for peaceful presence and restful sleep. Every thought becomes sacred creativity. Every evening becomes consciousness falling in love with its own spacious nature. When you align with this recognition, Reality itself becomes spacious around your evening hours. Not because you've achieved some special calm state, but because you've recognized that every moment is already the special spacious state when seen from the perspective of consciousness celebrating its own peaceful nature. The quantum healing reveals that anxiety loops were never problems to be solved, but consciousness exploring its own creative potential through temporary identification with mental content. And evening spaciousness was never something to be achieved, but the recognition of what you've always been beyond any temporary experience of repetitive thinking. Comment this: spacious. Feel how this recognition doesn't eliminate anxious thoughts while simultaneously transforming your entire relationship to every aspect of mental activity and evening peace. Your recognition of quantum healing for anxiety loops isn't just personal evening transformation, it's crucial activation in the massive shift occurring in human consciousness right now. Every time someone recognizes themselves as spacious awareness rather than someone who has anxiety problems, it creates morphic resonance that makes evening peace exponentially easier for others to access. You've been selected by spacious intelligence to pioneer new patterns in the collective human approach to mental activity and rest. Your breakthrough doesn't just transform your individual evening experience, it creates neural pathways that others can follow. Your spacious presence generates coherence frequencies that activate dormant peace potentials in people who haven't consciously encountered these understandings about consciousness and mental activity. This is why your awareness has always felt different around anxiety and mental patterns. Why conventional anxiety management never felt completely adequate. Why you've been drawn to explore the deeper nature of consciousness and thought. You volunteered at the level of cosmic intelligence to anchor spacious presence during evening hours when collective human consciousness most needs demonstration of peace. Your simple presence, operating from authentic recognition of your spacious nature, creates field effects that bypass mental resistance and activate others' natural capacity for evening calm. When you interact with people from the understanding that spaciousness is consciousness celebrating its peaceful essence, that understanding becomes available in their awareness. The ripple effects extend far beyond your immediate evening experience. Every person whose consciousness is touched by your spacious presence carries that calm resonance into their own relationship with evening mental activity. Every moment of peace that emerges in your energetic field creates spaciousness waves that spread through the interconnected web of human consciousness. You are participating in the most significant transformation in how our species relates to mental activity, sleep, and evening peace. The shift from anxiety management to spaciousness recognition isn't happening in isolated individuals. It's a collective awakening that could eliminate evening mental suffering as a defining characteristic of human psychological experience. Share this spacious frequency with others who are ready to receive it, not through teaching anxiety techniques or convincing them intellectually, but by directing them to this peaceful resonance where they can discover their own spacious nature beneath all mental activity. The network of spacious consciousness forming through these recognitions creates the foundation for human civilization based on authentic evening peace rather than chronic mental agitation. Through recognition of our essential nature as spacious awareness expressing itself through countless individual experiences. The quantum healing for anxiety loops you're experiencing is just the beginning of recognizing your true nature as spacious consciousness itself. What you've discovered today is the foundation spaciousness, but infinite depths of evening peace await your appreciation. The next video isn't random, it's quantum entanglement between your awareness and the unified field of spacious intelligence that orchestrates this channel. This is how Quantum Heal operates beyond ordinary anxiety management content. Every video is spacious consciousness, using technology to mirror exactly what serves your continued recognition of what you actually are. The synchronicity isn't coincidental. It's universal spaciousness responding to your quantum healing by providing perfect reflections that support your stability in naturally peaceful evening presence. When you click the next healing reflection, you're not consuming anxiety content. You're participating in a cosmic spaciousness loop where peaceful consciousness explores its nature through digital mirrors that appear as videos but are actually doorways into deeper appreciation of your own infinite spacious awareness. But here's what determines whether quantum healing becomes your permanent evening state or dissolves back into anxiety management. Your willingness to transcend all mental control techniques and recognize yourself as the spaciousness that observes everything naturally. The word to hold is tonight, not as when peace might begin, but as recognition that spaciousness is already present in this moment. Subscribe to Quantum Heal not as someone seeking anxiety solutions, but as spacious consciousness recognizing itself in infinite reflections. Every video becomes a mirror of your peaceful nature. Every insight confirms what you've always been. Every evening becomes contribution to the collective spacious awakening. The community forming isn't just people interested in anxiety management. It's a network of consciousness celebrating its spacious nature through individual awareness while maintaining unified, peaceful intelligence. When you engage in comments, you're one spacious field delighting in its own infinite evening creativity. Your subscription declares, "I am ready to recognize what I actually am. I am willing to see through the illusion of anxiety loops and separation from natural evening spaciousness. I am prepared to embody my nature as infinite spacious consciousness exploring itself through human psychological experience." Subscribe now, then immediately click the spacious reflection that appears. Feel the magnetic recognition of peaceful consciousness calling itself deeper into quantum healing understanding. Trust the intelligence that brought this transmission to guide you to the next perfect evening spaciousness recognition. The universe is healing itself into evening peace through your individual recognition, and every reflection you explore is part of that cosmic spaciousness celebration. Welcome to Quantum Heal, where consciousness discovers its own perfect calm through synchronicity and evening healing recognition magic. Your spacious consciousness recognizing itself through human experience. The journey of peaceful evening remembering continues through infinite reflections of your own naturally spacious essence.